Celeste Monroe had spent the past 3 years living in the shadows of other people's lives. She moved through the halls of Hayes Manor with silent efficiency, dusting the priceless sculptures, setting the grand dining table, polishing the marble floors until they gleamed. She was invisible, just another piece of the household, always present but never acknowledged. It wasn't that she lacked ambition. There had been a time when she dreamed of more, a future filled with possibilities rather than obligations. But life had a cruel way of erasing dreams, replacing them with responsibilities too heavy to ignore. Her younger brother, Leo, needed medical care. The bills stacked higher than she could handle, and every month it became harder to keep their tiny apartment. So she worked. She worked until her feet ached, until exhaustion blurred the lines between one day and the next. She worked because it was the only thing standing between her and the kind of life she refused to let her brother endure. That evening, as she wiped down the bookshelves in the grand library, she overheard Dominic Hayes speaking on the phone. His voice was sharp, commanding, carrying the weight of a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. "I don't care what the board thinks. The deal will go through with or without their approval." A pause. Then irritation crept into his tone. "No, I won't bring a date. It's a business dinner, not a spectacle." Celeste had long ago learned to tune out the conversations of the elite. It wasn't her place to listen, and Dominic wasn't the kind of man who tolerated unnecessary distractions. But for some reason, the conversation stayed with her as she moved through the house. She had worked for him long enough to know his reputation. Ruthless in business, emotionally distant. A man who built his empire with calculated precision, never letting anyone get close enough to become a liability. So when he called her name later that night, she expected another mundane task. She didn't expect an invitation into his world. "Celeste," he said, barely glancing up from his laptop as she entered his study. "Cancel your plans tomorrow night." She frowned, confused. "Sir?" He sighed as if he already regretted speaking. "I need someone to accompany me to the Harrington Gala. It's business, nothing more. I don't have time to find someone else." Celeste stared at him. The words made no sense. He didn't even know her beyond her job. Why would he take her? "I think you have the wrong person," she said carefully. You're exactly what I need," he interrupted. "Someone who won't demand attention. Someone who won't turn this into a spectacle. Just be present and don't embarrass me." Her pride bristled at his words, but she forced herself to think logically. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a command. And saying no to a man like Dominic Hayes wasn't an option, so she nodded. "Understood." "Good." He turned back to his laptop, already dismissing her. "My assistant will send you something appropriate to wear." She left the room feeling like she had just walked into something far more dangerous than she could comprehend. The next day, an elegant black box arrived at her small apartment. Inside, an emerald green gown shimmered under the dim light, the fabric softer than anything she had ever touched. There was a second box, smaller but just as expensive, containing a delicate pair of diamond earrings. Celeste swallowed hard. This wasn't just attending a business dinner. This was pretending to belong. For hours, she debated whether to call Dominic's assistant and tell them she couldn't go. But every time she considered it, she thought of Leo's medical bills. The overtime she worked, the nights she spent stretching every last dollar to make sure he had what he needed. This was one night where she would step into a world she didn't belong to, play a role she had no business playing. So she put on the dress. When she arrived at Hayes Manor, Dominic was waiting for her outside. His suit was tailored to perfection, his presence commanding as always. But when his eyes landed on her, something flickered in his gaze. It was only for a moment, barely there before he masked it with his usual indifference. But Celeste saw it. Surprise. He extended his arm. "Let's get this over with." The car ride was silent. Celeste kept her hands folded in her lap, hyper-aware of the weight of the earrings against her skin. When they arrived at the Harrington estate, she barely had time to process the sheer grandeur before Dominic was leading her inside. The moment they stepped through the gilded doors, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Conversations hushed. Eyes turned toward them, filled with curiosity. She felt the weight of their scrutiny pressing down on her, but she refused to shrink beneath it. Dominic, however, was unaffected. He walked through the crowd with quiet authority, acknowledging people with a nod or a handshake but never lingering. He was in control, always. Then, a voice cut through the air. "Dominic, I must say, I wasn't expecting you to bring a date." Celeste turned to find Vivian Lancaster, an investor with a sharp tongue and a sharper gaze. She was stunning, dressed in a gown that screamed old money and influence. Dominic barely spared her a glance. "Vivian?" Vivian's attention shifted to Celeste, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. And who might this be? Celeste could feel the unspoken judgment in her tone. She knew she didn't belong, but something inside her rebelled against the idea of being small. So she lifted her chin, meeting Vivian's gaze with unwavering confidence. "Celeste Monroe," she said smoothly. "It's a pleasure." Vivian's lips curved, as if amused. "Interesting." Dominic's fingers tightened slightly against her back, the only sign that he had noticed the exchange. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and hidden power plays. Celeste quickly learned that these events were more than just dinners. They were chess matches, each person maneuvering to secure their next advantage, and somehow she had become a piece on the board. She wasn't sure how it happened, but as the night went on, people listened when she spoke. At first it was small comments, observations about the market, quiet insights into trends. She didn't mean to contribute, but she had spent years cleaning the offices of powerful men, overhearing their conversations, piecing together information they never realized she had. By the time dinner ended, she wasn't invisible anymore. People were watching her, studying her, even Dominic. As they stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around them, he turned to her with a look she couldn't decipher. "You were supposed to blend in," he said, but there was no real irritation in his tone. Celeste met his gaze, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I guess I failed." For the first time since she had met him, Dominic Hayes smiled, and Celeste knew, without a doubt, that something had shifted between them. What she didn't know was that before the night was over, she would shock everyone, including herself. The grandeur of the Harrington Gala was almost overwhelming. Celeste Monroe had seen wealth before, but nothing like this. The ballroom was a masterpiece of excess. Gold-trimmed columns stretched toward a ceiling painted with intricate murals. Chandeliers dripping with crystals reflected the warm glow of candlelight, and waiters in white gloves moved like ghosts, balancing trays of champagne and delicacies more expensive than her month's salary. It was a world that felt untouchable, a world she had never been meant to step into. But now she was here, standing beside Dominic Hayes, who moved through the crowd with the kind of quiet dominance that made people part effortlessly in his wake. Celeste could feel the weight of their stares, the curiosity in their hushed whispers. The powerful men and elegantly dressed women surrounding her knew each other. They understood the rules of this world. And yet, no one knew her. That made her dangerous, unpredictable. The thought sent a thrill of nerves through her, but she kept her back straight, her expression calm. If they expected her to falter, they would be disappointed. Dominic barely acknowledged the stares. He was used to being the center of attention, accustomed to controlling every room he stepped into. But tonight, the focus wasn't entirely on him. It was on her. He had brought an unknown woman into their elite circle, and in a world where even the smallest shift in power was carefully measured, this was an unexpected move. He was aware of the questions his presence with Celeste would raise, but he didn't care. This was business, and in business, perception was everything. They barely made it 3 steps into the room before they were intercepted. "Dominic, I must say this is unexpected," came a voice smooth and sharp as polished glass. Celeste turned to see Vivian Lancaster, a woman whose presence commanded attention. She was stunning, dressed in deep red, her confidence wrapping around her like an armor of silk. "You never bring dates." Dominic's jaw tightened slightly. "And yet, here we are." His voice was flat, but there was an edge to it, a warning that he wouldn't entertain her probing. Vivian's attention shifted to Celeste, her red-painted lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And you are?" Celeste felt the scrutiny in that gaze, the silent calculation. If she faltered now, she would lose whatever fragile position she held. "Celeste Monroe," she said smoothly, meeting Vivian's gaze without flinching. "It's a pleasure." There was a beat of silence before Vivian's eyes gleamed with something like amusement. "Monroe," she repeated, as if tasting the name. "I can't say I've heard of you before." Celeste smiled, though there was steel beneath it. "I imagine you wouldn't have." Dominic's lips twitched, just slightly, before he said, "Vivian, as much as I enjoy these introductions, we have business to discuss." Vivian studied Celeste for a moment longer before stepping aside with a graceful shrug. "Of course. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other." As they moved further into the room, Celeste exhaled quietly. The encounter had been brief, but she knew what it meant. She had just been tested. She wasn't sure if she had passed. Dominic led her toward a private table where a select group of investors had gathered. These were the real power players, the ones who made decisions that shaped industries, and she could feel the shift in energy as they sat down. Among them was Maxwell Carrington, tall, broad-shouldered, exuding the kind of self-assured arrogance that came from knowing he was feared. His eyes flickered with interest the moment they landed on Celeste. "Hayes," he greeted, lifting his glass, before his gaze slid back to her. "And who might this be?" Dominic's fingers tightened, slightly on the stem of his wine glass. "She's with me," Maxwell smirked. "Clearly." He turned to Celeste, openly assessing. "Forgive me, but I don't believe we've met." Celeste knew this game. Maxwell wasn't asking because he was curious. He was establishing control, seeing if she belonged. She refused to let him rattle her. "No, we haven't," she said, holding his gaze. "But there's a first time for everything." Maxwell chuckled, intrigued. "That's true. So, tell me, Miss Monroe, do you think your companion here is making the right move with this merger?" The table went silent. Dominic's expression remained impassive, but Celeste could feel the tension in the air. This was a trap. If she answered incorrectly, she could damage Dominic's standing. If she hesitated, she would reveal weakness. So she didn't hesitate. She tilted her head slightly, considering Maxwell as if he were a puzzle to solve. "I think business is like chess," she said finally. "Every move has consequences, and only those who think ahead truly win. From what I've seen, Mr. Hayes doesn't make moves unless he's already several steps ahead." Maxwell's smirk faltered just slightly, but then he laughed. "Clever," he mused, raising his glass. "I like you." Dominic didn't react, but when he spoke, his tone was measured. "Celeste, would you excuse us for a moment?" She nodded, standing as he and Maxwell leaned into a hushed conversation. As she stepped away, she caught murmurs around the room. Whispers about her, about who she was. She knew she had made an impression. The question was it the right one? She moved toward the balcony, needing air. The city stretched out before her, glittering under the night sky. She had spent years in the background, working tirelessly while people like Dominic and Maxwell shaped the world. Now she was in the middle of it. She wasn't sure what it meant yet. "You handled yourself well." She turned to find Dominic standing beside her, watching her in that unreadable way of his. She exhaled a soft laugh. "Did I?" His lips twitched, almost amused. "You surprised them." She studied him for a moment. "Did I surprise you?" For a brief second, something flashed in his eyes. Something unreadable. Something dangerous. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. It's still early. Celeste turned back toward the city, but she could feel the shift between them. Something had changed. And whatever it was, she knew one thing for certain. This night was far from over. Celeste had spent years observing powerful men, but tonight, for the first time, she was in their world, not just watching from the shadows. The Harrington Gala had turned out to be something far more complex than she had anticipated. It wasn't just a social event. It was a battlefield, where alliances were formed and rivalries deepened beneath layers of charm and polished etiquette. Every word spoken carried weight, and every glance exchanged was a negotiation in itself. She could feel the tension lingering in the air long after her exchange with Maxwell Carrington. He had tested her, searching for a weakness, and she had held her ground. But she knew it wasn't over. Men like Maxwell never stopped at the first challenge. They played the long game. Dominic had barely spoken since their conversation on the balcony, his usual unreadable expression back in place. But there was something different in the way he moved, more controlled than usual, as if he was anticipating the next move before it happened. She had expected him to tell her to step aside, to let him handle Maxwell on his own. Instead, he had watched her carefully all evening, as if reassessing something he thought he had already figured out. It made her uneasy. She wasn't supposed to be part of this world. She wasn't supposed to matter. As the night wore on, she found herself studying Dominic as much as the people around them studied her. He had a way of commanding a room without saying much, a presence that made people either admire or fear him. But now that she was close enough to see him without the distance of employer and employee, she noticed something else. An isolation beneath the control, a kind of loneliness that had nothing to do with lack of company. It was as if he existed at the center of power but was never truly part of it. Before she could dwell on the thought, a man approached their table, leaning in to whisper something in Dominic's ear. Whatever was said made the air around him shift, tightening with something she recognized as irritation. He set down his glass with precision, turning to her with a look that sent a chill through her. "We need to leave. Now." She didn't question him. She simply followed as he led her through the ballroom, cutting through conversations and curious glances with the efficiency of someone who had no time for distractions. The moment they stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around her like a shock, a stark contrast to the heat and intensity inside. The valet had their car ready before she even realized Dominic had signaled for it. He opened the door for her, his silence more unnerving than his words. The ride back to the Hayes estate was thick with unspoken tension. Dominic sat beside her, his posture rigid, his eyes trained on the city lights blurring past the window. Celeste wasn't sure if she should speak, but the weight of the night pressed too heavily on her chest to remain silent. "What happened?" she asked finally. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then, without turning to face her, he said, "Maxwell wasn't supposed to be there tonight." His voice was quieter than usual, but no less controlled. "The merger we're negotiating is delicate. His presence means someone leaked information." Celeste frowned. "You think someone in your company is working with him?" Dominic's jaw tightened. "I don't assume. I find out." The words sent a chill down her spine. He said it with such certainty, as if he had done it before, as if eliminating threats was just another part of his business. She realized then that there were parts of his world she couldn't begin to understand, places where morality wasn't a factor, only power. And yet, he had brought her into it, even if just for a night. She turned slightly to face him, searching his profile for something human beneath all the ice. "Why did you bring me?" He exhaled slowly, as if debating whether to answer her honestly. "Because I needed someone who wouldn't be a liability." The words stung more than they should have. "So I was convenient." Dominic finally turned to her then, his gaze sharper than she had ever seen it. "No," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her breath catch. "You were necessary." The car slowed as they reached the estate, the gates opening silently to let them in. She didn't know what to say to that. The idea that he had chosen her, not because she was easily ignored, but because he had needed her, unsettled her in ways she wasn't ready to confront. When they arrived, Dominic stepped out first, offering his hand without hesitation. She took it before she could think too much about why it felt different than before. His grip was firm, steady, reassuring in a way she hadn't expected. Inside, the house was quiet, the staff long gone for the night. He walked toward his study, and she followed without needing to be asked. When he reached his desk, he leaned against it, studying her with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "Tonight, you didn't just attend a dinner," he said. "You were tested." Celeste crossed her arms, lifting her chin slightly. "I noticed." His lips curved, just slightly. "And you handled it better than I anticipated." She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or an admission that he had underestimated her. "So what now?" Dominic was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "Now, you have a choice." Her heartbeat quickened. "A choice?" He nodded, pushing away from the desk. "You can pretend this night never happened. Go back to being what you were before. Or—" He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sharp edges of exhaustion in his expression, the weight of a man who carried more than he let on. "You can stay in this world and see how deep it really goes." Celeste's breath caught. "You're asking me to work for you." "I'm giving you an opportunity," he corrected. "One that doesn't come often. One that could change your life." She knew it would. Knew that once she stepped into whatever role he had in mind for her, she wouldn't be able to go back. But maybe that was the point. Maybe she didn't want to. For years, she had been stuck in survival mode, always working, always struggling, never getting ahead. But tonight, for the first time, she had been seen, heard, respected in a room where people like her were never meant to have a voice. And it felt intoxicating. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze head-on. "What exactly would I be doing?" Dominic studied her for a long moment before saying, "Learning how power really works." Her pulse quickened, but she held his gaze. "And what do you get out of it?" His lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. A wild card, someone no one expects. The thought sent a thrill through her. She had always been overlooked, dismissed, placed in a role where she was useful but never significant. But Dominic saw something different in her. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she wanted to find out. After a long silence, she nodded. "I'm in." Dominic's expression didn't change, but she could feel the approval in the way he looked at her. "Good. Then let's get started." Celeste took a slow breath, knowing that whatever happened next, her life would never be the same. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of that. She welcomed it. Celeste had always known her place in the world. She had spent years being unseen, slipping through the corridors of privilege without a second glance. But everything had changed the moment Dominic Hayes had chosen her, not as a housekeeper, but as something more. Even now, as she sat in his sleek office, surrounded by the weight of power that radiated from every corner, she felt the shift deep in her bones. This wasn't just about working for him. This was about stepping into a world that had never been meant for someone like her. Dominic leaned back in his chair, studying her with that quiet intensity that had unnerved her since the moment they met. "You understand what you've agreed to, don't you?" His voice was measured, but beneath it was something else, something she couldn't quite name. Celeste met his gaze evenly. "I understand that this isn't just a job." A flicker of approval crossed his face, so brief she almost missed it. He nodded toward the tablet in front of her. "You start now. That has everything you need to know about our upcoming negotiations. Read it. Memorize it. By the end of the week, I expect you to be able to keep up." She exhaled slowly and picked up the device. The files were dense, filled with figures, projections, and names of people she had only ever read about in headlines. She had always been good at paying attention, at absorbing information from the conversations she overheard while cleaning the offices of men like Dominic. But this was different. Now she was expected to contribute, to play the game, not just observe from the sidelines. Hours passed in silence as she studied. Dominic worked across from her, making calls, issuing quiet commands that made things happen with startling efficiency. It was like watching a conductor leading an orchestra, every move deliberate, every word shaping the world around him. And, for the first time, she wasn't just an outsider looking in. At some point, Dominic's voice broke the silence. "Tell me what you've learned." Celeste didn't hesitate. "The merger is risky," she said, setting the tablet down. "If it falls through, the company takes a financial hit. But if it succeeds, you eliminate Maxwell Carrington as competition in this sector entirely." Dominic's expression didn't change, but she could feel his interest. "Go on." She crossed her arms, thinking. But Maxwell isn't reckless. If he showed up at the gala, it means he already knows more than he should. He's watching you, waiting for an opening. Dominic exhaled a quiet laugh. "You're learning," she frowned. "So what's the next move?" He tapped his fingers against the desk, considering. "We get ahead of him." Something in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. "How?" His gaze locked onto hers. "By giving him exactly what he wants." Celeste stared at him. "You want to let him think he's winning?" A slow, calculated smile curved his lips. "Exactly." There was something exhilarating about it, this dance of strategy, of knowing your opponent well enough to predict their every move. She had spent so much of her life reacting, struggling to keep up. But this was different. This was control. The next few days blurred together in a haze of long hours and quiet conversations. Dominic pushed her harder than she had expected, testing her instincts, challenging her assumptions, and she rose to meet every challenge, refusing to fall behind. One evening, as she sat across from him in his office, exhaustion creeping into her limbs, he closed his laptop and leaned forward. "You're handling this better than I thought you would." She raised an eyebrow. "You thought I would fail. I thought you would quit." His honesty surprised her, but she refused to let it show. "I don't quit." Something unreadable passed through his expression. "No, you don't." Silence settled between them, thick with something neither of them acknowledged. She should have looked away, should have ended the moment before it became something else. But she didn't. Instead, she found herself asking the question that had been on her mind since the night of the gala. Why me? Dominic's gaze flickered as if he had expected the question but hadn't yet decided how to answer it. Finally, he said, "Because you see things differently." She frowned. "What does that mean?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Most people in this world play by the same rules. You don't. You see things that others overlook. And that makes you valuable." The words sent an unexpected warmth through her. She had spent so much of her life being underestimated, overlooked. But Dominic saw her, really saw her. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. It's starting. She straightened. What is? He stood, already grabbing his jacket. Maxwell just made his move. Celeste's pulse quickened as she followed him out of the office, knowing that whatever came next, there was no turning back. Celeste had never been one to ignore her instincts, and right now, they were screaming at her that something was wrong. The moment Dominic had glanced at his phone, his expression shifting into something colder, more dangerous, she knew Maxwell Carrington had made his move. And whatever it wasn't good. She followed Dominic out of his office, her heels clicking against the marble floor as they moved swiftly through the corridors of Hayes Corporation. He didn't speak, but the energy radiating off of him was tense, calculated. He was already planning his next move. When they reached the private elevator, he pressed the button, his jaw tight with controlled anger. She studied him, realizing that for all his power, Dominic wasn't just reacting to Maxwell's attack, he was preparing for war. "What happened?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Dominic exhaled slowly, glancing at her as the elevator doors closed. "Maxwell's making a public statement. He's positioning himself as the more reliable investor, claiming he has inside knowledge that my deal is unstable. He wants to shake confidence in me before I finalize the merger." Celeste felt a chill run down her spine. "And does he?" Dominic turned to her fully, his blue eyes piercing. "That depends." "Did you tell him anything?" The accusation, however mild, stung. She clenched her fists, stepping closer. "I would never betray you." He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good, because now he thinks you will." Her breath caught. "What?" Dominic leaned against the elevator wall, his expression unreadable. "You impressed him at the gala, enough that he sees you as an opportunity. He wants to recruit you, use you against me." Celeste frowned. "How do you know?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, though there was no humor in it. "Because he just sent you an invitation." Her phone buzzed in her purse. She didn't have to look at it to know Dominic was right. The thought of Maxwell watching her, calculating her next move, made her uneasy. "What do you want me to do?" The elevator doors opened, and Dominic stepped out first. "You're going to accept." Celeste's pulse quickened. "You want me to meet with him?" He nodded, walking briskly toward his office, where his team was already gathering, murmuring in low, tense voices. "Maxwell thinks he's in control of the game. Let's show him he isn't." Celeste swallowed hard, following him inside. This was dangerous territory. Maxwell Carrington wasn't just another businessman. He was a predator, always waiting for the moment to strike. And now, she was about to walk straight into his den. The next evening, she found herself seated in an exclusive restaurant, the kind where deals were made over rare wine and whispered threats. Maxwell was already there. When she arrived, leaning back in his chair with the kind of confidence that came from knowing he held power. He smiled when he saw her, standing to greet her as if they were old friends. "Celeste Monroe," he mused, his voice smooth. "I was hoping you'd accept my invitation." She forced a polite smile, sitting across from him. "You made it hard to refuse." His smirk deepened as he signaled for the waiter. That's the idea. She knew what this was, a test, a dance of words and implications. She had spent enough time observing powerful men to recognize the game. Maxwell wasn't here to make small talk. He was here to measure her. As the waiter poured them both a glass of wine, Maxwell took a sip before setting the glass down, his gaze never leaving her. "I'll get straight to the point. Dominic Hayes is a sinking ship, and I have a feeling you're smart enough to see that." Celeste tilted her head slightly, keeping her expression neutral. "Is that so?" Maxwell leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel intimate. "You're new to this world, but you've already made an impression. That means you have potential. But potential means nothing if you stay loyal to the wrong man." She held his gaze, her heart pounding. "And you're saying you're the right man?" He chuckled, swirling his wine. "I'm saying I can offer you something Dominic never will. Power, security, a place at the table, not just a seat in the corner." Celeste exhaled slowly, pretending to consider his words. She had to play this carefully. If she rejected him too quickly, he would suspect. If she seemed too eager, he would never trust her. So she did what she had always done. She studied him, let the silence stretch long enough that he had to wonder what she was thinking. Finally, she set her glass down. "If I were to consider this, I'd need to know what you expect from me." Maxwell's smirk widened. "I like the way you think." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek envelope. "Inside this is an offer, a generous one. You'll be well compensated, of course, but more importantly, you'll have access, influence. You'll be part of something bigger." Celeste reached for the envelope but didn't open it. "And in return?" Maxwell leaned back, watching her like a cat playing with a mouse. "I need information, details about Dominic's deal, leverage." She met his gaze, letting the weight of his words settle between them. Then, carefully, she tucked the envelope into her purse. "I'll think about it." Maxwell's smile was slow, victorious. "Take your time, but don't take too long." The moment she stepped outside, the cool night air did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She had played her part well, but she knew this was only the beginning. Maxwell was dangerous, and now he believed she was considering his offer. When She arrived back at the Hayes estate. Dominic was waiting for her in his office, standing by the window, his posture tense. He turned as she entered, his sharp gaze scanning her face. "How did it go?" Celeste set the envelope on his desk. "He wants me to spy on you." Dominic picked up the envelope, his lips pressing into a thin line. "And what did you say?" She lifted her chin. "I told him I'd think about it." There was a beat of silence. Then Dominic exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Good." Celeste frowned. "That's it? No warning? No questioning my loyalty?" Dominic stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "I already know where your loyalty is, Celeste. The question is, does Maxwell?" She swallowed hard, realizing what he meant. This wasn't just about gathering information. This was about becoming the bait. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't back down. "What's the plan?" Dominic studied her, something flickering in his eyes. "We let him think he's won." Celeste took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had stepped into this world knowing it would change her, but she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to become part of the strategy, to be trusted with something so dangerous. But she wasn't afraid. She met Dominic's gaze, her voice steady. "Then let's play." Celeste had always known that power was a dangerous thing. She had spent years watching it from the edges, understanding how it moved, how it shifted from one person to another like a well-played game of chess. But now, she was no longer an observer. She was in the middle of it, a piece being moved on, the board. Except this time, she wasn't content with just being played. She wanted control over her own fate. Dominic had laid out the plan with the kind of precision that made it clear this wasn't his first time setting a trap. Maxwell believed he had found a weakness, an opening in Dominic's carefully built empire, and Celeste was the key. If he truly thought she was ready to turn on Dominic, he would begin to trust her. And once he trusted her, he would let his guard down. That was when Dominic would strike. But trust wasn't something Maxwell gave easily. He was a predator, always watching, always assessing. Celeste knew that the smallest misstep would cost her more than just her place at Dominic's side. It could cost her everything. The following day, she met Maxwell again, this time at an upscale bar, the kind where deals were made under the guise of casual conversation. He was already there when she arrived, lounging in a private booth with a glass of whiskey in his hand, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, keeping her expression unreadable. "I have to admit, Celeste," he said smoothly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." She gave a small shrug, tilting her head just slightly, the way she had seen women of power do when they wanted to appear both alluring and unreadable. "I wanted to hear more." Maxwell smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's what I like about you. You think before you act. Not many people in this world do that." She knew better than to respond to flattery, so she simply waited. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I need you to get me something useful, something I can use." Celeste pretended to hesitate, biting her lip as if weighing the consequences. "If I do this, how do I know you'll protect me if things go wrong?" Maxwell's smirk deepened. "Smart girl. You want security." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek black folder, sliding it across the table to her. "Inside are the terms of my offer. You won't just be protected, Celeste. You'll be untouchable." She took the folder but didn't open it. Instead, she let the weight of it sit in her hands, knowing that to Maxwell, hesitation would make her seem more real. If she accepted too quickly, he'd suspect. If she refused outright, he'd never offer again. Finally, she let out a breath. "I'll think about it." Maxwell studied her for a long moment before nodding. "That's all I ask." The conversation shifted after that, turning into casual small talk. But Celeste knew better than to let her guard down. Every word, every movement, was another piece of the puzzle Maxwell was trying to solve. When she returned to Hayes Manor, Dominic was waiting for her in his study, standing by the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in hand. He didn't turn when she entered, but she could feel the tension in his posture. "Well?" he asked. She set the folder on his desk. "He wants proof." Dominic finally turned, his blue eyes scanning her face, searching for something. "Did you give him any?" She shook her head. "Not yet." A slow breath escaped him, something between relief and calculation. He stepped forward, picking up the folder, flipping through its contents. Whatever was inside made his expression darken. "He's being careful," Dominic murmured. "He's not making any moves without insurance." Celeste folded her arms. "And neither should we." His gaze lifted to hers, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You're enjoying this." She hesitated, then admitted, "I am." He studied her for a moment before setting the folder down. "Good, because this isn't over yet." The next step of the plan was more dangerous than the first. If Celeste wanted Maxwell to believe her, she had to give him something real enough to convince him, but controlled enough that Dominic wouldn't actually be at risk. 2 nights later, she met Maxwell again, this time at a private club where discretion was promised to those wealthy enough to afford it. He was waiting for her at a dimly lit table, a bottle of expensive wine already open. "Celeste," he greeted, his tone warm, inviting. "I was beginning to wonder." She slid into the seat across from him, keeping her expression neutral. "I needed to be sure." Maxwell nodded approvingly. "And?" She reached into her purse, pulling out a single sheet of paper, a document Dominic had carefully prepared. It looked real. It felt real. But it was nothing more than a smokescreen. She slid it across the table. "This is the most I could get without raising suspicion." Maxwell picked it up, scanning it. His lips curled in satisfaction. "Now we're getting somewhere." Celeste kept her breath steady, waiting for his next move. "You did well," Maxwell said, setting the paper down. "But you'll need to do better." She raised an eyebrow. "How much better?" His smirk deepened. "Enough that Dominic never sees you coming." The word sent a chill down her spine. Maxwell wasn't just testing her anymore. He was setting her up for something bigger, something that went beyond simple corporate sabotage. She needed to warn Dominic. That night, when she returned to Hayes, manner, Dominic was already waiting for her in his office. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. What did he say? Celeste closed the door behind her. He wants me to take you down completely. For a moment, Dominic didn't move. Then he exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Of course he does. She stepped closer. Dominic, this isn't just business for him. He wants to destroy you. Dominic's gaze darkened. I know. A beat of silence stretched between them before Celeste spoke again. So, what do we do now? He looked at her, and for the first time since this game had started, there was something almost vulnerable in his eyes. We finish this. Celeste nodded, determination settling deep in her chest. She had been pulled into this world by chance, but now she was making a choice. And she wasn't just doing it for Dominic, she was doing it for herself. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting, and she intended to win. Celeste had always believed that power belonged to those who had the privilege to wield it. For years, she had watched men like Dominic Hayes and Maxwell Carrington move through the world with an untouchable confidence, making decisions that shaped industries, while the rest of society merely adjusted to the ripples. She had been an observer, a worker on the fringes of their world, never expecting to be anything more. But now, as she sat across from Dominic, in the dim light of his private study, she realized that she had become something else entirely. She was no longer just a piece in the game. She was playing it. Dominic sat back in his chair, fingers steepled together, his gaze steady on her as she recounted every word of her meeting with Maxwell. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush her. He just listened, absorbing the weight of what she was saying. When she finished, silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken understanding. Finally he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. I knew he would come for me. I just didn't think he would do it like this. Celeste leaned forward, her voice quieter now, more measured. He thinks I'm his way in. He believes I'll deliver you to him. Dominic's expression didn't change, but there was something sharp in his eyes. And will you? She didn't hesitate. No. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an intimacy in the quiet, something neither of them acknowledged, but both could feel. Dominic had spent years trusting no one, building walls around himself so high that even those closest to him never truly knew him. And yet here she was, someone who had started as nothing more than a housekeeper, standing at the very center of his empire, holding pieces of his fate in her hands. She wasn't sure when things had shifted between them, when their interactions had stopped being purely transactional. Maybe it was the night at the Gala when she had held her own in a room full of predators. Maybe it was when he had looked at her and realized that she saw more than he expected. Or maybe it had been gradual, woven into the late-night conversations. The trust he had placed in her, even when he claimed not to trust anyone. Dominic finally stood, walking to the bar in the corner of the room and pouring himself a drink. Maxwell is smart, he said, his voice thoughtful. But he's arrogant. He underestimates people he doesn't consider his equal. He turned back to her, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He underestimates you. Celeste lifted her chin. Good. A small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Good, he echoed. She watched as he took a sip of his drink, his mind already working through the next steps. You'll meet with him again, he said. You'll let him think you're ready to betray me. And when he's confident, when he believes he has everything he needs, that's when we'll take him down. Celeste felt a pulse of adrenaline. And how do we do that? Dominic set his glass down, stepping closer. We give him exactly what he wants, and then we make sure it destroys him. The next few days were a careful balance of manipulation and strategy. Celeste met with Maxwell again, carefully feeding him bits of information that were just believable enough to be dangerous, but controlled enough not to put Dominic at real risk. She played her role well, hesitant, but tempted, wary, but intrigued. Maxwell, for all his intelligence, didn't see the trap being laid for him. He saw what he wanted to see. A woman who had stepped too close to power, and now wanted a piece of it for herself. Each meeting with Maxwell made Celeste more aware of the fine line she was walking. She could feel the danger, the way one wrong move could tip everything into chaos. But she had never been afraid of hard choices. She had spent her entire life making them, learning how to survive in a world that was never meant to be kind to people like her. One evening, as she sat in Dominic's office reviewing the final stage of their plan, he leaned against the desk beside her, watching her carefully. "You don't have to do this," he said. She looked up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Yes, I do." His expression softened, just slightly. "Why?" She hesitated before answering. "Because I know what it's like to be powerless, and I know what it's like to watch people like Maxwell take whatever they want, knowing no one can stop them." She held his gaze. "I want to stop him." Something flickered in Dominic's eyes, something deeper than approval. He nodded. "Then let's finish this." The final meeting with Maxwell was held in a penthouse suite overlooking the city. The air was thick with expectation as Celeste sat across from him, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Maxwell was relaxed, confident, unaware that he had already lost. "You've done well," he told her, pouring them both a glass of wine. "After tonight, you'll have everything you need. And Dominic Hayes? He'll be nothing more than a cautionary tale." Celeste took the glass but didn't drink. Instead, she met his gaze steadily. "And you're sure this will work?" Maxwell smirked. "I always win." Before he could say anything else, the door behind them opened. Celeste didn't have to turn to know who it was. Dominic stepped into the room with the kind of quiet authority that made the air shift instantly. Maxwell stiffened, his confidence flickering. "Hayes." Dominic smiled, slow and dangerous. "Carrington." For the first time since this had begun, Celeste saw something rare in Maxwell's expression. Uncertainty. He realized too late that he had been played. Dominic moved closer, his voice calm. "You should have been more careful, Maxwell. You thought Celeste was your weapon, but you never considered that she might be mine." Maxwell's jaw clenched. "This isn't over," Dominic chuckled. "Oh, but it is." By the time Maxwell understood the depth of his mistake, it was too late. The evidence Dominic had prepared, the carefully laid trap that Celeste had helped set, unraveled Maxwell's empire within hours. His investors abandoned him. The media tore him apart, and the business world turned its back on him. He had thought himself untouchable. Now, he was nothing. Later that night, as Celeste stood on the balcony of Hayes Manor, staring out over the city, Dominic joined her. They didn't speak at first. The silence between them filled with the weight of everything that had happened. Finally, he said, "You were never just a piece in this game." She turned to him. "And what am I now?" He studied her for a long moment before saying, "Whatever you want to be." For the first time in her life, Celeste believed him. She had spent years being unseen, struggling to survive. But now she had power. She had control. And she had Dominic Hayes at her side. The game was over, and she had won. Just as Celeste and Dominic believed the game was over, a call shattered their brief moment of victory. Dominic's phone buzzed, the name flashing across the screen making his expression darken instantly. It wasn't an associate. It wasn't a rival. It was Maxwell Carrington's personal lawyer. Dominic answered, his voice sharp. "Speak." The response was calm, calculated. "Mr. Hayes, you might want to turn on the news." Celeste rushed to grab the remote, her heart pounding as the screen flickered to life. The headline sent a chill down her spine. Billionaire Maxwell. "Carrington missing. Foul play suspected." She turned to Dominic, her pulse racing. "What did you do?" But Dominic looked just as unsettled. His jaw tightened. Nothing. For the first time, true uncertainty crossed his face. Maxwell had been backed into a corner, but now he had vanished, without a trace. And that meant only one thing. This wasn't over. What really happened to Maxwell? Is he planning something even more dangerous? Stay tuned for the next explosive chapter. Subscribe now so you won't miss what happens next.